Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and start this last panel of the day. Well, I definitely know when we did our first session, I could say good afternoon, and the room instantly got quiet, so I know we're all getting much more friendly with each other. It took a little bit longer, but thank you very much for giving me your attention. I'm again Michael Thompson. I'm the director of the Council of State Government's Justice Center, and we got a chance to meet at the opening plenary. And you'll recall during that opening plenary, I expressed my immense gratitude to the terrific team of staff that we have, and told you that I got the terrific opportunity as director to be able to kick the conference off but not have to do much, or if any, work to actually put the whole conference together. I do think that you're going to find this is going to be a really interesting conversation, and that's very much what we intend it to be. I've already told our group here that I put them all in comfortable chairs and told them they're not going to be making presentations, but in fact we're going to be having a conversation about the issue that we all know we're supposed to be driving towards, which is reductions in recidivism, but just how complicated and tense that can actually get when we really focus in on that metric. So I'm looking forward to this panel conversation. The other duty that I often seem to get assigned is when we have one of our speakers who's coming in at a time we don't exactly know, and they're going to leave not exactly we're sure when. And we are going to be thrilled to welcome Congressman Chaka Fattah from Philadelphia, who's the ranking member of the Appropriations Subcommittee for the Department of Justice. So at some point you're going to see Congressman Fattah come on stage and join us and give us a few remarks, and I'll ask our panel's forgiveness for turning the microphone over to him. But with that, let me tell you a little bit more about what we're hoping to accomplish during this particular panel, and then we'll get into it. So first, I know that you all have been hearing about recidivism rates, and you've been hearing numbers, and I'm sure you're used to these numbers. You've used them in your grant applications over the past several years, and you've been hearing just over the past 2 days 66% of people returned, released from prison, rearrested. You hear about 50% reincarcerated. Then you hear different numbers for within 3 years, 2 years, and this just gets to be one big jumble of national numbers. And so we hear those huge recidivism numbers, and then we hear about programs that stand up and say, I have a recidivism rate of 10%. I have a recidivism rate of 5%. I've heard people talk about no people returning at all, a recidivism rate of 0. And so on the one hand, you know, we hear about these big national rates. We heard about the Department of Labor program and the recidivism rate that it's experiencing of 14%. And so, you know, we live and breathe this stuff. Imagine how confusing it is then if you're a policymaker who doesn't focus exclusively on this, and you hear all those numbers, and then you also hear that nationally recidivism rates haven't changed at all in the past 25 years. I mean, imagine how confusing this must all get. And imagine how further confusing it gets when you're told you need to refund a reentry program. And so you hear this jumble of numbers, and you just heard this tear-jerking story from the Boy Scouts who told you their funding was being eliminated for the nuns who are helping kids with autism. And then in comes your program to talk about the person who committed crime, who did this awful thing, and you just need a few $100,000. And then they remember those recidivism stats, and you know, it's a pretty difficult predicament to be in. So that's the backdrop, right, against which we're all working. We have a lot of excitement and support, as we've heard from these key policymakers. At the same time, patience is wearing thin, right? I've talked to a lot of Appropriations Committee chairpersons across the country and in Congress, and from their perspective, they've been working on this now for 10, 15 years, appropriating hundreds of millions of dollars. And again, what can you tell me about what's actually changing in terms of big picture national numbers? And those numbers, again, aren't as compelling as what we'd like them to be. They're good problem statements, not as good opportunities and successes we'd like to be able to talk about. So here we have this terrific panel, and what we've asked our panelists to do is first, we're going to ask Ryan King, who heads up the entire research division for the Pew Center on the State's Public Safety Performance Project, to help get us a better understanding of not just nationally what's happening in terms of recidivism, but state by state what's happening in terms of recidivism, and what does that actually mean. And we're going to ask everybody to pronounce recidivism as many times as they can, because then we're going to count how many times they mispronounce it during the course of this panel. But at any rate, So Ryan's going to kick us off with a presentation that's going to give us this national overview. And then we're going to have a conversation with our panel, and I'll first be talking to Director A.T. Wall. A.T. Wall is the Director of the Department of Corrections in Rhode Island. He is the President of the Association of State Corrections Administrators, so the association of all the corrections directors across the country. He is the longest-serving corrections director in the country, which I think you can all agree is an extraordinary accomplishment in and of itself, now having served 4 governors, Director Wall. So switching parties, it really tells you a huge testament to just how much the great state of Rhode Island values Director Wall and how respected he is nationally. Our other panelists are Dr. Gary Dennis, who I introduced earlier and thanked for all the great work that he does at the Bureau of Justice Assistance. Dr. Dennis is a corrections professional through and through, the former deputy director in Kentucky, really gets these issues from your perspective as state and local government officials and also from the community provider perspective, and we're fortunate now to have him overseeing all of this work over at BJA. And then from the perspective of a nonprofit organization running one of these programs, Chris Watler from the Center for Court Innovation. And Chris heads up the Harlem Reentry Court project, which is really special and we're going to hear more about. And Chris has been with the Center for Court Innovation now for several years and directs this specific reentry initiative for the Center for Court Innovation. So those are our panelists. And again, we're going to start with a presentation from Ryan King that's going to walk us through the data. Again, we know it's late in the afternoon, so I've asked Ryan if he can keep this brief. So we're going to try and keep it to 10 to 12 minutes, and then as the panelists are going to hear, I'm going to interrupt them anyway and start asking questions. So I appreciate you humoring me with that with the advance fair warning. So Ryan, with that, I'm going to ask you to walk us through your findings.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see so many people gathered and interested in talking about recidivism. So I'm going to give, as Mike said, some very brief remarks and a little bit of an overview of a study we released just a little over a year ago, which provided analysis of state rates of recidivism. It was the first collection of its kind, and then I'm going to seed way so we can have a much more, I think, engaging and interesting conversation. I'm hoping that I'll try to do that with one mic in my hand too, and well as some notes. So let me give briefly give you a sense of why we did this study, why we felt it was important to do this study. First of all, as Mike said, and as many people are familiar, recidivism conversation has been very much governed by national numbers over the years. So the 2/3 rearrested within 3 years, the 50% back to prison. Those are national figures based upon a study using data from 15 states. And so that has been, when we talk about recidivism, that conversation begins and ends with those single national numbers, which at this point now are from people released in 1994, the most recent numbers, and the study itself is about a decade old. So we certainly don't have the most current numbers. We also understood the national numbers are obscuring interstate variation. And we know in criminal justice policy and corrections and sentencing that these are, for every different state you go to, there are different wrinkles, and there's importance in understanding what's going on from state to state. We also recognize the importance of understanding recidivism measures to policymakers who are seeking results from their correctional system. And then finally, I think, and most importantly, what I think I want to try to drive through as I set the stage here, is our goal to move this discourse around recidivism beyond the numbers. So beyond the 67.5, beyond the 50%, but instead to engage in a deeper conversation about what drives these numbers, what the policies and practices are that result in higher or lower rates of recidivism, and then, of course, most importantly, what can we all do to try to bring those recidivism rates down. So I want to give a quick overview of the study. It was, as I mentioned, it was the first of its kind 50-state survey of recidivism. Recidivism was defined as return to prison within 3 years. So rearrest and reconviction are also frequently the way recidivism is measured, because we wanted to get a real sense of what the impact of recidivism was on state prison populations. That was why we chose that measure. We were looking at data for offenders released in 1999 and 2004, so 2 separate cohorts, and we followed them for 3 years. and we collected recidivism measures for new crime and technical violations of supervision. We broke them down in that way. So it's important to know we actually went out and did original data collection with the states. We created our own definition in the survey in an attempt to get uniformity from state to state. So instead of just asking a state, give us what you measure of recidivism, we said, here's how we measure recidivism. Let's get a sense of all the people who've come out in a given year, how many of those people are coming back into a state prison. And as I would just give a caveat, there are differences in the definitions and data collection procedures which warrant caution about making interstate comparisons. And we'll dig into a little bit about that. I mean, one thing that we didn't want to end up having to do with this was be something about, you know, these guys are high, they're bad, these guys are low, they're good, but recognizing there's a deeper story there. So without further ado, get a look at some of the national numbers first off. And as you can see here, we said America's national recidivism rate remains stubbornly high. For the 1999 cohort of people who were released, 45% returned to prison within 3 years. The 2004 cohort, that number was about 43%. Now, you're going to ask, as Mike said, how does that comport with the 50% from BJS? I thought you were clarifying things. Now I'm even more confused. You're throwing more numbers out. So the states we had, for the 1999 cohort, we had 35 states. For the 2004 cohort, we had 41 states. As I mentioned, BJS had 15 states. So we had a much more nationally representative collection of data. So that's first off. And so by doing so, we had more states that had lower recidivism rates, which is why we see our number down a little bit lower. But we believe these numbers are both more current as well as a better national picture of recidivism. But I think importantly, one way that you can compare these numbers is we actually pulled our number, we focused only on the states that BJS collected with ours as well. So we took some, out of all the states we had, we winnowed down to the ones where we had for BJS numbers because we wanted to see how they looked compared to 1994. And interestingly enough, we pulled California out of those numbers. And when we did that, our numbers were pretty much the same as what BJS had from the 1994, which gave us what we think is a pretty confident story about the fact that recidivism, really going back to the 80s, has been pretty flat. California is important. If you pull California out of the national BJS number, the 50% drops to 40% return to prison. So unsurprisingly, California has a disproportionately large impact. So I'm going to put up here a whole bunch of more numbers to confuse matters, but I'm going to let these kind of sit up here and give you a sense of what the country itself looks like. I don't expect you to memorize all of those, but it will give you a little bit of a flavor about some of the geographic variation in recidivism. You get a sense from the blue, the different shades of blue are the states that had decreases between 1999 and 2004, and then in the rust color, and the different variations of rust color, you get the ones that had increases. Now, here's, I think, is one of the most important points that I want to make here and to set the tone, which is when you look at these numbers and see the different numbers in the states, the changes in the states, we need to go beyond just saying, well, the states that went up, recidivism went up, but they're doing something bad, and the states that have recidivism were going down were doing something good. We had a couple examples in the report we talk about that I want to leave with you to think about. One is we talk about Oregon and Oklahoma. They were the two states with the lowest rates of recidivism in our report, about 23% or so recidivism rates returned to prison in the report. We talked to Oregon officials when we were working on the report, and we have a little kind of case study in the report talking about the fact that this Oregon officials had undertaken a very deliberate attempt to address their recidivism rates. They had gone out, they had a whole bunch of policies and practices they put in place with the goal of reducing recidivism. So if you talk to Oregon officials, you see that decline up there, which is in the neighborhood of 32%. They're going to say that decline was not a coincidence, that was not the result of outside forces, that was a deliberate result of the policies that we had put in place. You go and talk to folks in Oklahoma who had the same recidivism rate, and their argument is that our prison is full of low-risk offenders who are not convicted of particularly serious, severe offenses. And so by definition, these were people who were at very low risk of reoffending. So our numbers are artificially low. So you get a sense where if you looked at just the numbers, you'd say, well, the story is the same. Oklahoma and Oregon are national leaders in keeping recidivism down. But if you actually wanted to take that number and turn it into a discussion about policy and practice and learning, you get two very different stories. And I think all of us in the room would then have a conversation about, how are resources being used? Are they being allocated most effectively? And then a third state I would throw in there is Minnesota was the state that had the highest recidivism rates in our study. It was a little over 60% of people in the state of Minnesota returned to prison within 3 years. Needless to say, we got some feedback when the report came out quite quickly from the commissioner in the state of Minnesota, and their response, I think, was one that we can all understand and we talk about in the report, and is that we actually reserve our prison space for much higher risk, more severe offenders. Offenders convicted of more serious crimes, and therefore, by definition, we are more likely to have higher rates of recidivism. A critically important distinction, and one that I think, as I mentioned, the warranting some caution about making interstate comparisons. This is exactly why I would warrant that caution. Because just jumping to the fact that Minnesota is 60% bad, Oklahoma 25% good, not recognizing that actually there's two very different things going on in those states. And this is what I mean when I talk about moving this conversation beyond the numbers and into the policy. First, you can get a sense here of what some of the cost savings are in the states. So anybody, you won't be surprised that recidivism is a huge driver of our prison population. And you get a sense that these are just the 10 states with the largest cost savings. If they reduce their recidivism by 10%, not 10 percentage points, but 10%, they could have saved nearly $500 million. So you're talking about big savings in some of these states. A state like California that has very high rates of recidivism, unsurprisingly, making a 10% reduction can have a significant impact. So we're talking about real cost savings, and there are policies that can be put in place that can bring these about. So in the interest of providing this context, and then I'm going to get out of the way here, I wanted to walk you through here. I'm going to throw these slides up. The policies and practices that impact recidivism. This is, when I say look beyond the numbers, these are the kind of things that I want us to look beyond. This is where we need to have the conversation. The different factors that are impacting recidivism. So in a case like, you see here, we've got assessment, offender risk profile, and state sentencing laws under the pre-entry category. So in a state like Minnesota, they're saying that we're putting a lot of serious violent offenders away in prison. So by definition, these are individuals that have a higher risk of reoffending. We're going to have higher rates of recidivism. And you can see by definition the people who are coming in to a system, the type of offenders, the type of crime rates, what sentencing laws are, who gets sent to prison, how long they get sent to prison versus diversion, let's say in some cases. All of those things are going to affect your offender mix, and they're going to have impact on recidivism. And the assessment point there I think is important. I know that you guys have been talking about risk assessment throughout. You'll notice we've got them in all three stages. Assessment and classification as also key indicators. States do different things. They use different risk assessment tools. They have very different impacts on recidivism. So understanding why a state is at 50% or 40% or 30% in recidivism, these are the kind of questions that we need to be asking. We talk a little bit in the behind the walls section about some of the policies and practices within prison that affect recidivism, what corrections officials can do in planning for reentry, in preparing people for reentry and coming out, and then release criteria. Who's being released after serving how much time? And then finally the reentry process. The assessment and classification remain important factors, but you also see how are people handed off from prison? What does a reentry handoff look like? Supervision length. We talk about North Carolina in there as a state that has very, very short periods of supervision. So if you have a shorter period of supervision, you're going to have much lower technical violation rates. And if I recall correctly, North Carolina had the lowest rates of recidivism for technical violations. So again, there's a deliberate policy behind that number, and it's important for us to take that apart and have that conversation. And so I would leave you with that. I think is what's most important in terms of clarifying these numbers is take the number and just use that as the beginning of the conversation. Let's move beyond. Let's take this opportunity to really dig in and understand these policies and practices. And I think it's important. One thing that we've talked a lot about from a research perspective is this idea of developing risk-adjusted recidivism measures. So we're not talking about just a giant pool of offenders and saying, well, all these people who come out, let's do this. But instead, we're talking about identifying, let's say, the group A, B, and C that have certain common characteristics and measuring recidivism that way. There's different ways we can come at recidivism. We've taken it at this point simply as The people come out, 3 years later, how many of them are back in prison? That's just the beginning. That's the beginning of the conversation. There are a lot of different ways that we can measure it, and I think as we try to move that conversation in that direction, it gets us much further along the way to making recidivism a performance measure. That's something that both practitioners in the field as well as policymakers can really use to assess the performance of their correctional systems.
Great. Thank you very much, Ryan. That was incredibly succinct for a ton of complex information. But I think just if I heard right, really a couple of or three key take-home points. The first here is that while we hear that recidivism rates haven't moved much nationally, when we look at them state by state, you can see that every state's recidivism rate, or nearly every state's recidivism rate, is moving in some direction. So we see national relatively flat, but we look at it state by state and we see movement in every state. Some increasing, some decreasing, which is why we don't see any movement, right? It almost all wipes each other out. But some states are going up, some states are going down. And your point is to caution people from interpreting too much just because it's going in one direction or another, or to compare from one state to the next. But we can take away from this that a state certainly can have an impact on its recidivism rate. Terrific. So at this point, I understand that we have our special guest has arrived, and so I'm going to introduce him now. Just in, I feel like I'm introducing a fighter almost from Philadelphia, I'm really thrilled that Congressman Chaka Fattah is here to join us. And Congressman, if you want, you can just take a seat right in that chair and I'll bring a microphone over to you. Thrilled that the Congressman has joined us. I really want to impress upon everybody here just how committed Congressman Fattah is to this particular issue. He didn't just come over from Capitol Hill. Like Congressman Davis, the Congress is in recess this week, and Congressman Fattah drove all the way down from Philadelphia to be here with us today, specifically for this particular meeting. During, I think what you'll all agree, is a time when most members need to spend every day at home if they can because of election season. And so what I can tell you is that this is representative and typical of Congressman Fattah and just how dedicated he's been to this issue. In Congress, Congressman Fattah is the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee for the entire Department of Justice. And that Appropriations Committee doesn't look just at the Department of Justice. It's also the Department of Commerce and also Science. So on any given day, they're moving from issues about how much money to spend on NASA to how much money to spend on the FBI to how much money to spend on the U.S. Department of Commerce. And I was fortunate enough to watch and be a part of hearings that Congressman Fattah, together with the chairman, Congressman Wolf, Republican from Virginia, were convening on the topic of reentry. And if you go into this hearing room, it's a small room in the bowels of the Capitol. As you can probably imagine, not much media or constituent interest in the topic of reentry. And with all of those important subjects that they have to focus on, he didn't have just one hearing on reentry or two hearings on reentry. They had 9 hearings on reentry where they just brought provider after provider up, people who've been incarcerated, crime victims. Tell us what works to reduce recidivism. I mean, they dove into the issues with a level of detail and focus and care that was really stunning. And it's just incredibly inspiring, I know, to all of us in the field that you would spend as much time as you have to really prioritize this issue with all the other important business you have. So we're immensely grateful to you, Congressman. Thank you so much for being here. And we'd love it if you'd say a few words to the group.
Well, let me, is this on? All right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And welcome to Washington. I know that you've heard from the Attorney General, Eric Holder, and from Congressman Danny Davis, who was actually the prime sponsor and author of the Second Chance Act. I had an opportunity to co-sponsor, but Danny was really the leader in this effort. And I understand the Secretary of Labor was here earlier today, Hilda Solis. So let me just say a couple of things very quickly, because I know you have a very distinguished panel and you're going to have a serious engagement. But I am the ranking Democrat on the Appropriations Committee that handles these matters. And the most important thing I could tell you is that in the House bill, we have allocated now some $80 million to Second Chance programs for what would be for us fiscal year 13. The Senate bill's at $25 million. The Senate will take up their bill on the floor a week after next, and then we will go to conference between the House and Senate. So the most important thing, if you don't hear anything else I say, is that we need to be fighting to make sure that your U.S. Senator knows that you really like the House number a lot better than the Senate number, all right? That's number one. But I come to this from an interesting path. My family's been engaged in helping young men re-enter the community from incarceration for over 3 decades in Philadelphia. And my parents, my mom just turned 80, they're in the season of retirement now. So I've been intimately aware of many of the challenges that face particularly youthful offenders as it relates to reentry. And even though we call these second chance programs, a lot of these young people never had a first chance. But what's important is that there's still an opportunity at whatever age to intervene positively. And what is amazing, I just had a chance to have a cup of coffee with the former chairman of the Budget Committee for the Congress, and I was telling him about the second chance programs. We were downstairs in the hotel lobby, and I said that this was something in which we got some of the most conservative members of the Congress and some of the most liberal members of the Congress to actually come together on, which is something akin to a miracle here in Washington. But the fact that we incarcerate more people than any other country in the world, that over 1.7 million people in prison, our federal prison system is got significant overcrowding problems, as do your state and local systems. So, but we know with a certainty that 95% of these prisoners today will be living in our neighborhoods tomorrow. And the only real question is whether or not we're going to do what it takes to make sure that that can be a productive reentry in terms of family reunification, in terms of jobs, in terms of housing issues, because we know a lot of those who are incarcerated were homeless for months prior to their incarceration. We know that addiction issues and the lack of ability to deal with conflicts are some of the challenges that some of these, those who are going to be reentering have challenges around. So I just want to thank you for what you're doing. I came here both in symbol and in substance to tell you that at the most important levels of the Congress in terms of where we are determining budget priorities, I hold the work that you're doing as being extraordinarily important. In fact, if you look at the $30 billion in the Justice Department budget, I'm not sure you can find more valuable expenditures than the work that you're doing, because you're going to save money for our criminal justice system, but much more important than that, you're going to save people from having to be victimized by people re-entering the criminal aspects of their lives. You're giving them an opportunity to walk a different path. And for that, the nation should be grateful. We're going to fight for a higher dollar amount this year, and somehow I imagine in future years we may even be able to start talking about ramping up this program a little bit more based on the great success that you're all having. So thank you very much, and again, welcome to Washington.
Congressman, thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate all that you've done on behalf of the field and reentry and Second Chance, so thank you again. So where we left off was Ryan had just given us this terrific presentation to demonstrate that states really could have an impact on reentry. And I mentioned at the outset of my remarks that members of Congress, governors, state legislators are all basically saying, okay, we can have an impact on recidivism. We are putting money into this, as Congressman Fatah said, to save money, and as Ryan's slide showed. So let's get from reentry to actual recidivism reduction. And so with that, we're seeing more and more legislators and governors call in the corrections director and say, so we've been talking a lot about reentry, let's start talking about recidivism reduction. And I'd like to turn the question to Director Wall. Director Wall, again, the longest serving corrections directors in the country, the president of all the corrections directors. And Director Wall, this is a difficult question, right? It's a lot to put on the shoulders of an agency that, as it is, has a very difficult and challenging job and only finds itself under more and more pressure. So walk us through a little bit, if you would, not only the mindset of you, but corrections directors everywhere, many of whom have literally just gotten the job, and a congratulations, and then suddenly, and by the way, you're going to reduce recidivism rates, right? Tell us a little bit about what goes through the mind of the corrections directors and what corrections as a field has experienced over the past couple of years.
Well, I suppose it came as a little bit of a shock. We had embraced reentry as sound public policy, something that was enjoyed in bipartisan support, and that we did think was important to safe communities. We should probably have realized that the kind of engagement that we saw at the federal level and from our leaders in the states was ultimately going to lead to some expectations of accountability. But when the time came that reentry began to evolve into recidivism reduction, I think my initial reaction was, whoa. I didn't realize I had signed up for something that explicit. And the concern, I think, is that we felt like there's so many variables involved beyond what we can do when someone's in custody. I mean, we were thinking about demographics, we were thinking about police arrest policies, we were thinking about prosecutorial discretion, and so forth. But really, at the end of the day, we know that the expectation of corrections is that the people who were released from our custody will reoffend at lower rates. And we have come to not only accept it, but recognize that we can do this.
And just, if you could, just a little bit more. I mean, I think oftentimes corrections directors feel like, what about the other agencies? You know, why aren't they being asked these questions? Why is it that, you know, this is being targeted on corrections, if you will, and is that appropriate?
I recall going to a community forum in my home state of Rhode Island, and somebody stood up and said to me, so, you're the director of the corrections department, is that right? I said, yes. And he said, so who exactly do you correct? And I wanted to go into a lengthy explanation about all the reasons why we shouldn't be held specifically to account, but ultimately, what I sense is that this is what our core mission is. It doesn't mean we can and should try to do it alone. We do need to marshal resources and partners, but that it really is on us.
I recall the director of corrections from Oklahoma saying at a national meeting that when the governor wanted to know what the state was doing to reduce recidivism, she wasn't calling the state colonel of police, she was calling the corrections director. So I think the point being here, right, that even though many agencies are relevant to this and are implicated, it's corrections that really feels like it's in the spotlight on this, and understandably so. So if you could, you talked about this increasing appreciation over the past couple of years that has occurred among leaders in corrections, that they are being held accountable for actual recidivism reduction. Could you talk to us a little bit about a meeting that occurred in December that I know you were instrumental in pulling together all of the state leaders in corrections and what happened there?
Sure. It emerged when it became clear to us that there were expectations on the part of members of Congress that the money that they've invested over the years, which does amount to hundreds of millions of dollars at this point, would lead to some tangible results. And that it was important for us, if we were to continue to enjoy that kind of opportunity to make a difference, to start claiming outcomes. It led to a meeting that was actually facilitated by the Council of State Governments Justice Center in Washington this past December. It was unique in my experience, and I have been in corrections for 36 years. Every single state corrections department's leadership was represented there, along with reentry champions in each jurisdiction and the coordinators of reentry in each of our departments. And I was very proud of the profession, because by that point it was clear that we were willing to step up and accept this responsibility. And by the time the meeting was over, we were well on our way to developing recidivism goals in each of our states, starting to formulate plans as to how to achieve those numbers, and recognizing that we were going to be tracking programs and announcing results. And I say that I felt very, very proud of our profession.
Thank you. It was, I think, that, many folks said it's the first time they've ever seen all 50 states represented in territories where you had the leadership of every corrections department, legislators, governor, staff, judicial leaders. If I could just ask the audience by a show of hands, how many folks here are familiar with who went from their state, or even that there was a meeting on this in December? Just show of hands, how many people are aware of this? Okay, so some folks, but the majority not, which is understandable, and that's why we're having this conversation right here. And so, Dr. Dennis, I'd like to turn it over to you and ask a little bit about, from BJA's perspective, what do you think that the grantees should know about all of the state leaders coming together, focusing on recidivism, committing to the exploration of actual targets for recidivism reduction? How is this relevant to all the grantees in the room?
Well, first, Mike, let me give a little background information. All of you who are in here are second chance grantees, and you're familiar with the second chance grant. 3 years ago, when I inherited that in my portfolio at BJA, part of the Second Chance Act was a commitment to the reduction, a 50% reduction in recidivism over 5 years. After having worked in corrections for some 35 years at that point, I thought to myself, wow, what an ambitious goal. And so when we set about writing the solicitations to fund these, we knew that we had to come up with some way to address that goal or to measure it. So we developed our own definition of what we thought recidivism should be, and that was if someone returned to prison or jail, was reincarcerated as a result of the commission of a new crime or violation of conditions of supervision, that would be a person who would be a recidivist. It seemed to me, and I was very naive at this point, that would be a very simple thing for our grantees. They would have an established baseline recidivism rate for a target population that they wanted to serve with a second chance grant, and then they would mark their success against that baseline recidivism rate and see if they could achieve some success. As most of you in this room know, what we found was that the state of our ability to collect data, and Brian knows this, was not what we thought it was. People were not able to establish really valid baseline recidivism rates. They were not able to have access to the data that allowed us to do that. So when the group came together in Washington, and as AT said, there was this strong commitment on the part of the state directors of corrections to undertake some level of reduction of recidivism at a statewide level. We sensed that was an opportunity for us to really demonstrate the impact of the second chance money. So we and Director O'Donnell, who you had the opportunity to hear at the opening session, we strategized about what can BJA do to help facilitate this. We've put over $208 million out in grants for second chance, but we've got to do something to kind of push this thing over the edge. So Director O'Donnell made the commitment at that meeting that AT talked about that the BJA would carve out $5 million and that we would put out a special solicitation for a statewide recidivism reduction program, and that we would make those resources available in terms of $5 million grants to 5 state departments of corrections, $1 million grant for a 2-year project period, if they were willing to step up and make what I termed as a bold and ambitious but reasonable commitment to reduce recidivism. We put that solicitation out on the streets. It closed the 21st, which I think was yesterday. I've sort of lost track of time. And we had 24 applications from that. So 24 of the 50 states have applied, and we'll be looking at those applications and making some decisions about where we would put that money. But I am really, really hopeful that we're going to be able to demonstrate at least 5 states that we can make a meaningful impact on statewide recidivism reduction. And I got several calls from people who are working on the solicitation. They said, well, what about this 50% reduction in 5 years? And I said, forget about that. One particular state called me and said, we have, and I believe it was like a 37.5% recidivism rate that is well documented. The data's there to support that. I said, wow, if you made a commitment to reduce that to 25 or to 26% in a 2-year period, what a wonderful challenge that would be. So we've let our folks know that, well, let me back up and say that it's one thing to say that we would like to ambitiously reduce recidivism by 50% over a 5-year period. Those of us who work in the field know that if you could reduce the statewide recidivism rate by 2 or 3 or 4%, that would be a fantastic accomplishment. So that's what we're looking forward to seeing those kinds of results in this solicitation.
Terrific, Gary. And I just want to underscore the point that you made. Half the states applied, right? I mean, the solicitation, the meeting was in December. The solicitation came out about a month and a half later and was due 8 weeks after that, right? And within that very short time period, and with all the anxieties that corrections appropriately felt, we still saw half the states submit applications, which is really impressive.
It was very impressive, and I haven't, because I've been here at the conference, I haven't had a chance to get back to the office and get into our grant management system, but I'm very, very excited to take a look at those applications. They'll all be peer reviewed by, we're going to have a very select group of peer reviewers, people who really understand reentry and understand how the business, if you will, to review those applications. But I think we're going to have some very exciting proposals.
So, Director Wall, just advice that you would have to participants. I'm sure a lot of folks are wondering, did we apply? Did our state apply? What would you advise participants to do just to figure out how they fit into all this?
I would say that they probably would have access to information about who applied. I'm not sure, Gary, how they would find it, but certainly those states that have applied will be looking to the grantees here to, in essence, conscript you into our recidivism reduction efforts, and we are no doubt hoping and counting on you in turn to yield the kinds of results that will help us show that we can achieve these goals.
Great. So now we're all in this together, and we're going to talk about the implications of that in just a minute. Dr. Dennis, did you want to add
just
something?
one other comment. I think AT's right. I would encourage you when you get back home, check with your Director of Corrections to see if Georgia applied, or I happen to know some that did, if they applied for that. But one of the things that has impressed me greatly about the Second Chance Act, and I had the privilege of being involved in the very beginning, and the very first conference that we had that year, we made the 50 awards, the 35 mentoring grants and 15 demonstration grants. But to come into this room yesterday morning and to walk in at about 7:30 when there was no one here and see all these tables and all these chairs and realize that in a few minutes 700 or so people were going to come into this room, it is absolutely inspiring. And I think that the legacy of the Second Chance Act, there are going to be a lot of things said about Second Chance, but the one thing that the Second Chance Act has done has promote collaboration and cooperation and the leveraging of resources. And even though the State Department of Corrections had to be the applicant agency for these grants, we all know that in order for any state, any jurisdiction to have any meaningful impact on recidivism, see, I can't even pronounce it, recidivism, that they have got to reach out to the private nonprofits, to the faith-based organizations. They've got to pull a collaborative group together to make it happen. So I think the strongest applications that we're going to see for this are going to be the ones that are most inclusive. And my guess is that a significant number of folks in this room and the organizations that you represent will be involved in that process as we move forward.
Great. Thanks, Gary. So, Ryan, a quick question back to you before I had some questions for Chris at the end. So you said something very quickly and almost in passing, but I think is really significant. Gary was talking about the pressure of a 50% reduction, and you said something quickly like, not to 10 percentage points, but 10% reduction. And I know for all the math gurus, of which I'm not one, sort of that can wash over your head pretty quickly. Can you walk through, just in concrete numbers, what that actually means one more time for the group?
On the 10%?
Well, I'm thinking of a 33 to 30%.
Right, sure. It's a perfect example. If your recidivism rate, you mentioned the 37.5 recidivism rate. So a 10-point reduction would be from 37.5 to 27.5, which is a significant number. A 10% reduction is 37.5 or minus 3.75. So you're talking about a little under 4 points to get it down. And that would be a 10% reduction. And those are the level of numbers that you can see some of the cost savings from some of the bigger states I presented. But I think it shows quite clearly that, with targeted efforts, these reductions are certainly achievable and significant cost savings can come as a result.
So I think that's just really important, right? Because we all want to give the best talking points possible to our policymakers, and we go out there and we instantly say 10%, 10%, we're just being fast and loose with the numbers, and then they instantly think 37 to 27. Well, we can actually give them a 10% reduction and only have to move the needle, right, 3 percentage points. And so that's really, really important, and I think a point that everybody wants to take home. Again, probably obvious to most people in the room. For somebody who flunked out of math, something that I have to keep hammering into my own head. My wife does the algebra homework in my house. But at any rate, Ryan, one other question for you, so don't put the microphone down just yet, and that is, how come policymakers constantly hear about these programs that have these fantastic success rates, yet still see the recidivism rates going up? How do they reconcile that? I mean, what do folks like us tell them? Like when programs come in and they say, I've dropped recidivism 50%, 75%, I have a 0% recidivism rate. Why are they saying then, why is it that our recidivism rate is going up? What's going on? How do they reconcile those two things?
Well, I think what we saw before with the state variation and the national number is what you're talking about on a local level. So at the national level, you've got states, many of which have had significant declines in recidivism, but the national level is flat. And in the case that you raised, Mike, there are situations where there could be a number of different programs that are out there having success, but overall across the state, the state number average is made up of a whole bunch of other factors. So you've got these programs over here that are successful, these programs over here that aren't successful, and you get very different rates. So the state level may look flat, and I think the key point to me is the need to disaggregate these data, and that's what we started with this report, to move from the national to the state. I think what Mike is saying is we need to go even more micro and really understand at the very local level how recidivism can change. And I think it's important too. I said at the end, and I want to reiterate, the need, if we go out and we say something like, here's a pile of right here, 40% recidivism rate, we're going to reduce it 10% to 36%. That's going to be our goal. In many ways, you could argue you're setting yourself up for failure if you're just taking a pool of all the offenders coming out. One of the things that I think is most necessary is to begin to move beyond this national number into, let's start breaking it out. Whether it's one of the things that we're currently working on in a project in New Jersey, and we'll have a report out in this fall, is an effort to try to create risk-adjusted rates of recidivism, to create pools of different types of offenders, and you could vary them on a whole bunch of different factors. And say, all right, now we've identified for these particular high-risk people, a 60% to 55% would be successful. For these middle, 50 to 40, and for these folks, 30 to 15 is what we're shooting for. Varying our targets and varying our goals based upon the type of factors that are up there, the type of offenders that we're dealing with, and breaking them down into these smaller groups, I think, is a much better way to put these policies in place. It's a much better way to measure performance, and I think most importantly, it takes us a little bit away from what Mike is saying, which is really, in a way, setting yourself up for failure. If you just take a state level number and say, I'm going to drop it, and you're only working on this small portion of folks over here and not all these folks over here, you're not going to have the kind of impact that you want.
So Ryan, the policymaker who hears a program and says, I have a 15% recidivism rate, and it's 50% ordinarily, so I am doing great. The first thing the policymaker needs to be saying is, well, that's 50% is national. Let's look at our state recidivism rate.
Right.
And then the second thing, what you're saying is, well, maybe it turned out that the people that you were serving already had a 15% recidivism rate. Maybe they were just the low-risk people that you ended up creaming, and in effect doesn't really know that what you served is a true cross-section of the population. And you're taking it a step further. Don't even go for a cross-section. Go for the ones that are dragging the recidivism rate up.
Yeah, let's find out. So if you're 15%, what was it about those particular offenders? What can we learn? What lessons can we learn? And can we apply them to other groups of offenders who may not be receiving any kind of intervention? They're just being released.
So that's one issue. AT, how many people are released annually from the Rhode Island Department of Corrections? I think many people would think of a small system. How many people released annually?
Well, if we're talking about releases from sentences, it's about 4,000 a year.
4,000 people. And the largest single nonprofit reentry program, roughly how many people is it serving in a given year?
Oh, a few hundred.
A few hundred, right? And many programs out there serving 30, 50 people that are coming to you talking about their recidivism rates. So certainly another factor I think that we have to be thinking about is, and I've seen governors stand up and do this and talk about this great big initiative, but we all know in the back of our minds that initiative is only serving 30, 40, 50 people, but we're talking about thousands of people released. How are we going to affect the whole statewide recidivism rate when we're only serving that tiny subset? Need to frame it at the outset, as Ryan's saying, so that it's clear that maybe we won't affect the statewide rate, but we'll affect the subset of some group. So let's turn now to a person who's in a position that I think many folks can identify with. Chris Wadler, as I mentioned earlier, directs the Reentry Court Initiative in New York City specifically, in Harlem. And Chris, I know one of the issues that so many of the programs out here deal with is we think we're doing a really good job, but we don't have the data to actually demonstrate it. This is what Dr. Dennis was talking about earlier. We're using every penny we've got just to run the program. I know that one of the things that's been really special about the Harlem Reentry Court is that you've made it a priority to actually get data on your program. Could you tell us a little bit about how you managed to pull that off?
Yeah, no, thank you. And those of you who run nonprofits will identify with the penny, because sometimes it feels like that's exactly what you're working with, to reduce recidivism and do all the things that nonprofits are asked to do. And so we were very fortunate back in 2008 to start to have a conversation about what we wanted to do with the reentry court, both to raise money, that was a real driver for me, but also how we could do the job better. And our partner, who had been working with us since 2001, the state's parole agency, was also talking with us, and we kind of were wondering, well, we had a lot of ideas, what could we do? The other thing that was going on from between 2008 and then ultimately released in 2010 is that we did a retrospective evaluation of our program going back to 2002 through 2008 to really begin to look at what kinds of effects the program had even on a kind of shoestring budget. And to be honest, the findings were mixed. The good news for us was lower recidivism. So our parolees tended to commit fewer crimes, and that was indeed good news. The less than good news was that our violations were higher, and that really made us take a step back, because we thought, wow, we're working together with our parole officers. We're in the community. We were committed to a neighborhood-based strategy that was Harlem-based and getting parole staff to be in Harlem, working with us, and working to communicate with them. And what we had gotten, we suspect, was that we were seeing guys more often. We knew what was happening with them. The parole officers knew what was happening with them, and that probably was what was driving the violation process. So we began to really dig into the research and look at what it was that we needed to do as a program. And it was very fortunate that the Second Chance Act
So I want you to go there in just a minute, but before I do, can you just clarify for the group, where did you get the dollars, or how was the evaluation actually financed? Because I know that's a challenge for many folks in the room.
I am very fortunate to work for the Center for Court Innovation. So we have a research team. We had done an initial evaluation, for the program, and essentially we're using our resources in-house to fund a second look at the program. We thought it was time to do that.
So you hire me as a government affairs consultant when you get the results of this evaluation, and my first question is, looking at the results, why did you do the evaluation in the first place? This is something that we probably don't want policymakers to see. And I think this is a fear that a lot of programs have. Maybe when we get the data, maybe this isn't something that's going to help sell the program. Yeah. So how did was there talk about burying it? What was the reaction in the Center for Court Innovation and you, and how did you use that information to the advantage of the program?
The reaction on our end was wanting to really use that information and to kind of be transparent, about what we had learned. We have not been shy about talking to funders and the community and our stakeholders about the results and really wanting to do something different. My analogy is, if we're driving a car, the windshield was dirty and the wipers were broken, and we really didn't know. And so the evaluation really kind of cleared that away and allowed us to see a problem with the program that before then we just didn't know. We thought we were doing good work. We learned that we were affecting recidivism in terms of new crimes, which are great, but not so great when it came to violations.
And so what actual changes in program design did you make as a result of the findings?
Yeah. So with our Second Chance Act grant, we did a couple of things in response. The first thing is we deployed an actuarial risk and needs assessment tool, the Compass. And we were fortunate that New York State has a reentry plan, and so we kind of went to that plan, and I have to give a lot of credit to Director O'Donnell when she was in New York. Really, she brought together the cabinet. She really made sure that the state had a firm plan in place. And so we deployed the use of Compass with our Second Chance Act grant. We hired some additional case managers that allowed us to go in pre-release into facilities and actually engage folks before they come out and do much more robust pre-release work, even for folks who were upstate. We could reach out to them, via phone and correspondence. The other thing that we did directly in response to the violations was we incorporated a graduated response and incentive protocol that was based in part on work that the Vera Institute did for New York State Parole. But Parole wasn't ready to roll it out, but they gave us permission to use it in our program. And that tool helps to guide decision-making around what happens with guys who are non-compliant. And the final thing, and this really in part came from parole staff, is that we are now we do cognitive behavioral therapy, thinking for a change, on site. So we are getting high-risk guys into that program, and that's something that was very important because our judge, our former judge, she retired, she kept saying, all these guys, you keep sending them a treatment program, some of them just need, some kind of counseling because they, and that got us thinking about CBT. And so we're very fortunate Second Chance Act funding has allowed us to deploy that. The last thing I'll say is, we are evaluating the effectiveness of this. We got Parole to agree to a random assignment enrollment process into our program. So, and we folks are randomly assigned into our program. The parole staff no longer make the decisions about who comes into the program. We get a list from the state. We scrub that list down, and we make assignments into the program. That evaluation is an enhancement to it under this year's Second Chance Act grant, where we're going to look at kind of procedural justice. We're going to interview folks both in the control and treatment group and kind of look at procedural justice issues and legitimacy issues and see if there are differences there as well.
Great. So again, I think you can see really interesting adjustments that were made in the program design as a result of what you saw from the evaluation, which you're confident now has actually gotten better results, and you're going to actually confirm that through this follow-up evaluation, which is terrific. So I mentioned at the outset that this is a caffeine-free session, and in order to really inject a little bit of electricity into this, what I'm going to do with our two folks there at the end, if they don't mind, is a little bit of role-playing. I'm going to ask you to assume the positions, not necessarily that you're currently in, but of the generic corrections administrator and of the generic provider. Dr. Dennis has just talked about a solicitation that went out. And so you two are in a state that was fortunate enough to receive the grant. Director Wall, you're finding out that your staff have just committed you to a recidivism reduction target of about 10%. They didn't do, though, the 10% the way Ryan and I cleverly figured it out. They were more ambitious and just said 10 points off of what they're currently doing. You go out and you see Chris's program as a key weapon, and this, I think you used the word conscript earlier, Chris, you've been drafted, we're going to go through this role-playing right now, and Chris, you've just found out that you now are also responsible for getting this 10% recidivism reduction target. Walk me through what needs to happen on your end in order to help the director achieve this goal.
This is a great role play, but it's actually also real life for me as well. What we need on our end, first of all, is critically important is information. I think one of the hardest parts working with corrections is actually getting good information about clients in a timely fashion in order to do the kind of prep work that needs to happen with them before they're released. And that is something that even now we're still kind of struggling with. But if we're really going to impact recidivism, we need to have a real sense before they come out of their risk levels, particularly for violent offending. We also need some general information from corrections about the population and recidivism in general. Because we might be asked to report ourselves on, how we're affecting, what's the baseline and how we're affecting recidivism. The other thing that is very important for us is really getting your approval to make sure that there's a strong research component, that we do that up front. And all too often, getting that approval up front just takes a lot of work and time. So I would be concerned that at the end of this, some period, we need to actually report some results. I would want to know that corrections actually would cooperate with us in doing that, so that we would have access, for example, to be able to interview folks, even folks who've been reincarcerated, and that we would have access to information that we need about their behaviors.
So, Chris, I'm not going to put you on the spot with New York, but just take the generic state. These people are going to be under parole supervision. Any expectations you have about the parole officers with whom you'll be working?
I do, and I recognize that as a nonprofit, we don't get to select the POs who would be part of this this process. It would be great if we could, but we understand that. But I would be very interested in with this new program. I'd be very interested in making sure that there was real joint training, and that the pro staff couldn't opt out of it. That they had to be there when we trained on motivational interviewing, when we trained on our cognitive behavioral therapy program, so that there was a common language that everyone on the team, my staff and the parole staff, would have.
So Director Wallace is pretty tactful. It was a fairly straightforward wish list. So just to summarize here on this shopping list, because you were very smooth about it, Chris, but to put a fine point on it, you want to make sure that each of the people that you're getting has had a validated risk assessment that's been conducted of them. You want to know that you're getting people that in fact score at certain levels on that risk assessment. You want to make sure that you're getting those people quickly, that they're not taking too long to get to you, and that you know who they are in advance so that you can reach out to them and have them the day that they come out. You want to make sure you have information about them so that you can make sure you're providing them with the right services. And you also want to make sure that you're getting the right parole officers to make sure that they have the right attitudes and they're going to approach this in the right way. And then you want to make sure there's a research component that's built in that. So you got lots of kindred spirits out there who are right there with you. So Director Wall, this is a fairly straightforward shopping list. Can you deliver on each one of those?
My reaction is, hey, you want it all. Certainly our goal would be to provide you with each of those components that we are, however, and that I, by the way, as director, may serenely tell you that it's what you'll receive. Meanwhile, at the levels below me, all kinds of things are getting in the way. The fact is that we are large bureaucracies, we're cumbersome, we're not necessarily lean, we have to follow a variety of sort of regulations and rules, and we still want these results from you, but I won't say that underneath, at the level of the ground, you're going to get everything you want.
Yeah. I've heard that also. but I am persistent, and the case that I would make is that it is very difficult to expect nonprofits and community programs to be held to the standards, that funders want and that our partners want, if we don't have the kind of information and the kind of real cooperation that we need on the ground in order to get that done. And that to me is not so much blaming anyone. It's really more about what the research says, the good work you need to do, how you need to do it. So it's hard to do that if you don't have that kind of partnership.
So let's turn the tables a little bit. Director Wall, it's clear what Chris wants for his program. Do you have any conditions? Let's say that you're going to do your best to deliver. You're telling your people you want them to deliver. What are the expectations of the program?
I would say that we will do our utmost to deliver what it is that you want. Our concern is sort of the mirror image of your own. We have our doubts that you have the capacity to deliver in the way that you say, that the very reasons why we find you appealing as a program are that you're close to the ground. That also means that we're not confident you're sophisticated enough to give us back what we need to make the case that you're successful. We're not sure that your line staff understand what kind of data we're looking for, how to enter it, how to do it consistently and report out. We're concerned that some of your personnel turnover may be high because you can't necessarily afford to pay the kind of wages that you'd like. So we have similar concerns that you do about your ability to do what we need.
And I would say that what's important there is what you're getting from the leadership is commitment. And I think for us, certainly in New York, that's what we've seen from the top is commitment. And I feel that if we have the chance to work with the line staff, we can develop that kind of trust and that culture that you need in order to be effective. Not that there won't be bumps in the road, but my problem is that their supervisors are going to need to kind of buy in, and so sometimes what may happen is that we're doing something with the team and the parole officer trying to do something, and then the area manager might say, well, no, actually you need to do these violations because that's our operating procedure. And so it would be helpful for us maybe to meet and to try to align the goals of the program and see the program as an opportunity to really learn and to grow, so kind of learning lab for the reentry work. And I like the point that was made earlier about you're not touching everyone, right? So the corrections agency, in New York, they have 58,000 inmates and 27,000 people coming out. And here you're talking about a program that even if we're serving 200, 300 folks, it's still a drop in the bucket. But what I would say is the neighborhood-based strategy is also important. That we're looking at those communities that are most impacted. So here's an opportunity for the corrections department to really stand up in a neighborhood like Harlem, where far too often, the corrections agency is a mysterious persona non grata, the empty chair, at the meeting, but having a big impact on what's going on in the lives of people, in the community. So, this is definitely about bold leadership, trying to get things done.
Director, advice that you would have to, we talked earlier about a conversation that would occur among some of the providers, finding out about a State Department of Corrections. They put in a proposal. It turns out that that they got an award. Now, let's skip past the point where there's actually, hey, we want you to be working with us on this, and to the brass tacks that you were getting to a little bit a while ago. I mean, I think what you describe is a very real exchange that's going to, has already been occurring in states and is going to happen now with even more focus and precision. What would be your advice to providers as they engage in those conversations in their states?
I would say that it's important to be persistent. We are large. A lot of things go on in our departments. What is of great importance to the provider and of great importance to us can sometimes get lost. So I would say, don't be shy. You need to keep kind of tugging on our sleeves and saying, we are trying to get this work done, we're trying to deliver, we're in partnership, don't forget about us. I would also say that some clearly identified boundary spanners between the not-for-profit and the department have to be in place. People who are going to resolve conflict, people who are going to cut through the red tape, people who are going to get things done. You need go-to people.
I would add maybe my advice to corrections officials is be interested in the capacity development of nonprofits in your jurisdiction. One of the things that I think corrections agencies and commissioners can do is to be helpful when nonprofits are pursuing grants. Those letters of support, providing data and information. Sometimes it is very cumbersome to get that if you don't already have a relationship. And I do think also corrections agencies can be active on task forces, whether it's statewide or local, assigning local people to kind of be involved so that we really are identifying both the capacity needs and the service gaps in jurisdictions, particularly where high numbers of men and women are coming home from prison.
So I want to go back to the point then of a state that gets a grant, because going back to some of the points that Ryan made and some of the numbers that Chris gave out, which were really helpful. 58,000 people incarcerated in New York State, 28,000 returned annually, about program capacity on your end of maybe 200, 300 people. Certainly there's other programs too in some of those neighborhoods. So how are we going to possibly demonstrate an impact on this statewide recidivism rate? Let's say it's around 40% that Ryan talked about earlier. Well, let's make this a little bit more manageable, right? Let's actually dive down and let's look at a particular region of the state. Let's maybe say this particular area. Maybe it's Harlem, maybe it's a particular parole region. And then to Ryan's point, don't just look at the 40% recidivism rate. Let's pull out of that the recidivism rate of a medium to higher risk population. So now we have medium to high risk group in this particular region of the state. And now you're sitting down and having that conversation. And it makes it a lot more focused and precise. And you can potentially, to BJA's need, actually potentially demonstrate some real reductions, especially when we start talking about a percentage reduction rather than percentage points reduction. So it makes it a lot more manageable and possible and conceivable, I think, for a lot of other folks in the room. We're going to wrap up shortly, but before we do, I wanted to see if Ryan and Dr. Dennis had any other closing points, and then last points from Director Wall and Chris.
Well, just to follow up on what you said, I'm a social worker way back when, and there was a principle that was called partializing. If you have a problem that's just so large, it's overwhelming, you look for that area that you can grab a hold of, you can solve a step at a time, you partialize it. And I think that's what we have to do with this recidivism reduction problem that we have. And one of the initiatives that BJS has partnered with both Pew and CSG and some other providers is our justice reinvestment model. And what justice reinvestment has allowed us to do is to examine the data and to determine what are the real drivers of our prison and jail population. And that allows us to understand where we need to target the resources. For people who are going to have success in this project, you can't look at it as a huge, overwhelming problem. You've got to partialize. You've got to understand what are the real drivers. What are those target populations that are contributing significantly to that overall recidivism rate. Target those, and in doing that, I think you're going to have more success at reducing the overall rate.
I just want to say how great it is to have this event and have the event in December, and how many people are talking about recidivism. Just the fact that this is a conversation we're having. We're already light years ahead of where we were in the past. Projects that I'm working on are attempting to push this ball forward and get at some of the data questions that we pose about looking at smaller populations, targeting our analysis and using that to inform policy. And I think also at the federal level, BJS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, has been in a long-term process of completely revamping their recidivism data collection processes. So when I mentioned that it had been over a decade since their last report had come out, they, I believe, are going to have new numbers out in the next year or so, and then their goal will be to have those numbers come out every year on a state basis. So I think it's good to see that folks in the room, organizations like folks up here, as well as the feds, are engaged in different levels from data to policy, and I feel, we're so much further ahead of where we were even a couple of years ago, and it's very encouraging about the direction we're moving.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Director Wall, Chris Wadler, any final points?
I would say that however frustrating it can be for community-based agencies to engage with corrections departments, at the end of the day, we know we need you.
Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel.